The world watched as the Middle East edged perilously close to a full-scale regional war in June 2025. The delicate balance of power, long maintained by a fragile status quo, shattered in just a matter of days. It all began on June 12th. Israel, citing existential threats from Iran's advancing nuclear program, launched a surprise and extensive air campaign. The primary targets were Iranian nuclear and military installations, a bold move that immediately torpedoed any hope for the US-Iran nuclear talks that had been scheduled. The world felt the immediate shock waves. Global oil prices surged by over 10%, a stark economic indicator of the geopolitical instability that had just been unleashed. The initial strikes were a clear statement of intent from Jerusalem. The escalation was swift and honestly, unforgiving. Following the initial Israeli attacks, the United States entered the fray directly on June 21st. In a coordinated and significant military action, American forces conducted major airstrikes against Iran's key nuclear sites. Facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan were hit hard. The International Atomic Energy Agency later confirmed that the damage was, quote, very significant, though questions remained about whether Iran had successfully moved sensitive nuclear materials beforehand. This direct American involvement transformed the conflict from a bilateral confrontation into a complex, three-way standoff, raising the stakes exponentially for everyone involved. The region, and indeed the world, held its breath. Tehran's response was not long in coming. On June 22nd and 23rd, Iran retaliated, framing its actions as self-defense under the UN Charter. It launched waves of ballistic missiles toward Israel, a direct challenge to the nation's vaunted air defense systems. Impacts were reported near critical infrastructure, including the Ashdod power station. Then, in the early hours of June 24th, the conflict struck at the heart of civilian life. An Iranian missile slammed into a residential building in the southern Israeli city of Beersheba. The attack was devastating, killing 3 people, a man in his 40s, a woman in her 30s, and a young man of 20, and injuring 6 others. The tragic loss of life brought the grim reality of the conflict home. Even as Iranian missiles flew, Israel was intensifying its own campaign. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, expanded their targets to include units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and internal security forces in major cities like Tehran and Karaj. In an unprecedented move, the IDF issued evacuation warnings for several districts in the Iranian capital, signaling a potential new phase of urban warfare. The cycle of attack and counterattack seemed unstoppable. Each military action provoked a reaction, creating a dangerous spiral of violence that threatened to engulf the entire region in a conflict with devastating and unpredictable consequences for all. The dance of diplomacy had given way to the drumbeat of war. The United States found itself at the very center of this dangerous escalation, not just as a combatant but also as a target. The massive Al Udeid airbase in Qatar, the logistical and command hub for U.S. Central Command, became a focal point of Iranian retaliation. On June 23rd, Iran launched 14 short and medium-range ballistic missiles at the base. This was a direct, unambiguous strike against American military power in the region. Iran justified the attack as a necessary response to the U.S. airstrikes on its nuclear facilities days earlier. The world watched, fearing a direct US-Iran war was now inevitable. This was the moment the conflict could have spiraled completely out of control. Remarkably, the attack on Al Udeid resulted in a very different outcome than many feared. US officials later revealed that Iran had provided an advance warning through intermediaries, allowing for the evacuation of personnel and the repositioning of aircraft. This crucial detail suggested the strike was more symbolic than strategic, designed to demonstrate capability without triggering an all-out American response. When the missiles arrived, U.S. Patriot batteries and Qatari air defense systems successfully intercepted 13 of the 14 projectiles. The single missile that got through landed harmlessly. There were no casualties and no significant damage, a fact that allowed Washington a narrow path to de-escalate. The incident highlighted the precarious position of U.S. bases throughout the Middle East. While Al Udeid was the primary target, initial and ultimately incorrect, reports also claimed that the Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq was under attack. This confusion underscored the chaotic nature of the conflict and the vulnerability of American forces stationed across the region. These bases, designed to project U.S. power, had suddenly become high-profile targets, placing enormous pressure on Washington's decision-makers. the strategic calculus for the United States had to weigh the need to support its ally, Israel, against the very real risk of its own forces being drawn into a direct and bloody war with Iran. Despite its role as a combatant, the U.S., under President Donald Trump, also leaned on diplomacy to pull the region back from the brink. President Trump's administration engaged in intense back-channel negotiations, with Qatar playing a pivotal role as mediator. In a surprising turn, Trump announced on social media that a, quote, complete and total ceasefire had been reached. He thanked Qatar for its efforts and, crucially, signaled that the U.S. would not retaliate for the symbolic strike on Al Udeid. This announcement represented a dramatic shift from military brinkmanship to diplomatic resolution, showcasing the dual role America was forced to play, both a powerful actor in the conflict and a key broker for peace. In parallel with the military conflict, a fierce war of narratives was waged by all sides, each attempting to control the story and justify its actions to a global audience. Israel, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, framed its initial strikes as a necessary preemptive war to neutralize an imminent nuclear threat. Before the ceasefire, Netanyahu claimed Israel was, quote, very, very close to achieving its war aims, portraying the campaign as a strategic success. However, when hostilities continued despite the ceasefire announcement, his defense minister, Israel Katz, immediately accused Iran of breaking the truce, ordering intense strikes on Tehran to cast Israel as the victim of Iranian duplicity. This narrative aimed to secure international sympathy and legitimize further military action. Iran, meanwhile, projected an image of defiant strength and justified self-defense. Its leaders consistently cited Article 51 of the UN Charter, arguing that its missile attacks on both Israel and U.S. bases were a legal response to aggression. Iranian state media worked overtime to shape public perception, claiming the ceasefire was, quote, imposed on the enemy by Iran's formidable military might. In one particularly bold claim, they reported that President Trump had requested the ceasefire in a begging-like manner. This messaging was designed for both domestic and international consumption, portraying Iran not as an aggressor, but as a powerful nation capable of standing up to both Israel and the United States and forcing them to the negotiating table. The international community responded with a mixture of alarm and urgent calls for de-escalation. Qatar, despite having its sovereignty violated by the Iranian missile strike which it condemned as an unacceptable act, emerged as a crucial mediator, earning praise from both Washington and Tehran. Russia offered diplomatic support to its ally Iran, but stopped short of any military commitment, a move that reportedly left Tehran dissatisfied. The United Nations condemned an Israeli strike that hit Evin prison in Tehran, calling it a grave breach of international law due to civilian casualties. France welcomed the ceasefire and pushed for a swift return to nuclear negotiations, reflecting a broader European desire to salvage the diplomatic track. This cacophony of claims and counterclaims created a dense fog of misinformation, making it incredibly difficult for the world to discern the ground truth. The ceasefire itself was a prime example. President Trump announced it, yet Israel did not immediately confirm it, and both sides accused the other of violating it within hours. Initial reports of attacks on a U.S. base in Iraq were proven false. This information warfare is a modern hallmark of conflict where victory is measured not just in territory gained or targets destroyed, but in the battle for public opinion. For citizens and policymakers alike, sifting fact from fiction became a critical yet nearly impossible task. Beyond the strategic calculations and political posturing, the conflict exacted a real and tragic human cost. The violence was not confined to military installations. It spilled into civilian neighborhoods with devastating consequences. In Israel, the city of Beersheba mourned the loss of 3 lives after a missile destroyed a residential building. In Iran, an Israeli airstrike on Evin prison in Tehran resulted in an unspecified number of civilian casualties, drawing condemnation from the United Nations. For ordinary people in both nations, the conflict meant nights filled with the terrifying wail of air raid sirens, huddling in shelters, and the constant fear of an attack from the sky. This was the grim reality of the war for those living under the flight paths of missiles and jets. The crisis triggered a palpable sense of panic, leading to scenes of evacuation and displacement. As Israel's international airspace was closed, images emerged of people attempting to flee the country via the Herzliya Marina, a desperate bid to find safety. In Iran, the Israeli military's evacuation warnings for districts in Tehran forced residents to make an impossible choice: stay and risk their lives, or flee their homes for an uncertain future. These moments reveal the profound disruption to everyday life. The war was not an abstract event happening to soldiers and governments. It was a terrifying intrusion that tore apart the fabric of society, instilling fear and uncertainty in millions of people who simply wished to live in peace. The economic repercussions were felt globally, most acutely in the volatile oil markets. At the outset of hostilities, the price of crude oil skyrocketed by more than 10%, reflecting fears of a wider, supply-disrupting regional war. This spike threatened to drive up energy costs and inflation worldwide. However, the markets reacted just as quickly to the news of a ceasefire. Following President Trump's announcement, oil prices plummeted sharply, with U.S. crude falling over 7%. This dramatic fluctuation demonstrated just how interconnected the global economy is with the security of the Middle East, where the actions of a few nations can have a direct impact on the wallets of people thousands of miles away. As we stand here today on June 24, 2025, the ceasefire holds, but it is fragile and fraught with mistrust. The immediate threat of a full-scale war has receded, but the underlying tensions that ignited this crisis remain dangerously unresolved. This moment demands more than just a temporary pause in hostilities. It demands a relentless pursuit of truth to cut through the propaganda and misinformation. It demands a global awareness of the profound human suffering caused by such conflicts. And above all, it demands a courageous and unwavering commitment to dialogue, diplomacy, and a lasting peace, so that the tragedies of the past 2 weeks are never repeated. The path forward is difficult, but honestly, the alternative is unthinkable.